research in my classes for the last, before I came to University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, I was teaching at Mississippi State. And so I usually would teach the intro classes, or which I really like, or the PhD level classes. So we had a PhD program there. So I haven't been able to have an opportunity to teach on topics related mostly to my research. And as Dr. Padilla was mentioning, a lot of my earlier stuff and even concurrent research broadly focuses on development topics. And only recently have I started examining some issues within immigration. And so I'm really looking forward to discussing these ideas, thinking about how we can expand these conversations, other, research papers that you guys have read, how it relates to kind of current debates within the broad literature, and how we can kind of advance some of those conversations. So okay. Oh, we're down. So the first paper that I'll talk about today is a forthcoming paper in public choice, and the title is pretty long, but it's on kind of understanding the US experience whenever we did a massive legalization of undocumented immigrants. It's called the IRCA, or the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. And we'll get into some of the specifics there. But basically what this does is it allows us to have more of what we would consider a natural experiment. So a lot of econometric issues, any empirical work, is that you have to run into, what would have happened if this event didn't take place? So what are the counterfactuals, or are you appropriately controlling for everything that you would need to? And you run into issues of endogeneity and reverse causality. And so it's always difficult to be very confident in modeling something and then saying what the result says and then prescribing some sort of policy. So this is what is unique about using this federal legislation as somewhat of a natural experiment to then look at, well, what happened when we legalized a large portion of immigrants somewhat overnight, and then how did that affect the state level institutions? So just giving a kind of a broad background in case some of you have forgotten the basic economic argument for understanding the importance of immigration. And I recently read Ben Powell and Narasta's book kind of describing this, the early literature and the benefits of immigration. And I was still even shocked at how big the benefit can be. And so the basic argument is similar to understanding a free trade argument, which is that we have different comparative advantages, whether that be in our land across countries, our people, or with capital and machinery. And so ideally what happens is you specialize in those comparative advantages, meaning that land can't move across countries, but capital and people can, so that people flow to where their highest valued use is, as well as whenever we think about capital flowing across countries or trade flowing across countries, goods and services. And so that's kind of the basic understanding of basic still underlying argument as the benefit of immigration. But then there are differences whenever we're talking about goods versus people. But overall, for most of the conversation within the economics literature for the past 20 to 30 years, it has supported this idea that if we have labor relocating from low productivity countries to high productivity countries, it's going to make everybody better off. We're going to see increases in global efficiency. And so I'm not sure if you guys have read the Michael Clemens 2011 paper, The $1 trillion bills left on the sidewalk. So that's that whole debate that he's kind of summarizing and, kind of punches you in the face and says, look, this is not, whenever we debate trade, we are talking about a few percentage points of world GDP, which is actually still huge in the absolute terms and can make people's lives better off for opening up trade borders. But whenever we're talking about migration, it doesn't even compare in the potential ability to make our world better in terms of just overall things that we care about. So economic growth kind of broadly represents other things that we care about. And economists use that as kind of a shorthand way, because economic growth is associated with higher living standards, better environment conditions, better healthcare, better education, all the things that we tend to care about. And so when we look at what would happen when we would open up borders for the free movement of people, it could be huge in terms of the potential gains for both countries. But also one thing to remember, and again, I think that you probably are always in this mindset in a class like this, is we're talking about people. So it's also, you have a human element. Whereas whenever we think about trade or service, your iPhone is coming across the border, and yeah, we still want our iPhone, but it's a little bit different when you're thinking about a human that's coming into another country. Well, then we enter into kind of a new era, or what is called in the literature, the new economic case for immigration restriction. So these are the Borjas and Collier arguments. But in general, the argument is they are humans moving across the border, and they voice themselves. And so there is a difference between goods and services and people moving, because they will potentially influence the place that they relocate. And so the kind of major research question in the immigration literature for the past maybe 5 to 7 years is, well, how does immigration of low-skilled labor from a poor country with low-quality institutions affect rich destinations that have high-quality institutions? So one example would be something like, if a country is, or if an individual is moving from a country that the norms of corruption are just part of their culture, or offering and accepting bribes, and then that's their way of doing business, and then they move into a country in which the rule of law is much better, and that's not the way of doing business, how would that affect over time that destination country's norms of doing business or attitudes toward corruption, for example? So just kind of summarizing some of Borjas's quotes from his main concern. For example, he says, what would happen to the institutions and social norms that govern economic exchanges in specific countries after the entry and exit of perhaps hundreds of billions of people? It seems inconceivable for billions of immigrants to move to industrialized economies without transferring the institutions that led to poor economic conditions in their home countries. So that is somewhat of a logical concern that he's putting out there, in the sense that whenever we think about why some countries are rich and some are poor, we really are, so again, most of my work is in development economics. We really are, for the most part, in development economics, restating with fancier data and econometric models what Adam Smith said. We need property rights, basically easy taxes, tolerable administration of justice. So government isn't burdensome, getting in the way. It's not corrupt. It's not stealing your property. Your neighbors, you have basically some belief in the court system that your neighbor, if they infringe upon your property, that you have some right to protect that, or if you enter into a contract with somebody, that it would be upheld. So again, our notion of what makes some countries rich and some are poor is just, in some sense, very basic principles. And so what Borjas is saying is these countries that a lot of immigrants want to come out of because of the poor conditions, they've been living and experiencing a situation which is much different than the institutions that exist in a high-rich destination country. So what if they come and transfer the poor institutional environment that they've currently been living in? And if that's the case, then the gains, those massive $1 trillion bills that Clemens talks about being left on the sidewalk, is overstated. And if there could be a potential cost that would wipe out all of the gains. So again, in econ, it's always about cost benefit. So sure, maybe there would be some of this, but Borjas says, it could be a situation in which it actually completely wipes out any benefit. And another quote that kind of summarizes this, it says, we wanted workers, but we got people instead. Uncomfortable as it may be, migrants bring their culture with them. And so culture is an important part of understanding human action, what we do as economists. We want to understand how and why people make certain decisions, why they act certain ways. And so we have to at least factor in cultural norms. And we see that a lot more in the development literature. And we see over and over again that culture definitely matters. So for example, high trust countries compared to countries that have low levels of trust are more developed, They find it easier to secure property rights, to have less corruption in those places. Their norms facilitate those good things that Adam Smith talked about a couple hundred years ago. And so it is a real concern in the sense of what if? But then if you, again, take like one more logical step is, well, why would you move from that type of environment and transfer those conditions that was causing the poverty that you're trying to escape from? Borjas, at least in my reading, and Dr. Padilla may be able to chime in on this at some point, does not address that, does not address, to me, a very logical fallacy in that people, so we're not talking about, he's not concerned about high skilled immigrants, which maybe they would move for other reasons, but low skilled immigrants are moving to escape poverty. They're trying to make their lives better off or their families' lives better off. So why is it then that they would move to a rich destination country in which they believe that environment is going to make their lives better off and bring with them the perverse incentives and the perverse policies that led them to try to escape to begin with? So I do think there is a part of the theoretical debate there that has not been addressed that could be interesting to have that conversation or pushback. So then that led to, okay, well, this isn't an empirical question. So we have the theory, the kind of original economic framework, comparative advantage, let people move to their highest valued use, massive increase in global efficiency. Then we have Borjas and Collier and a couple others chime in and say, not so fast. Maybe there's a potential cost that we're not thinking about. And so from the theoretical side, it's not completely resolved. So that's where we say, okay, let's turn to some data. Let's turn to some empirical analysis to see if it can shed light on this debate. So the cross-country evidence, I'm just citing kind of three of the main papers here. And again, some of you may be in this class that read it or been exposed to this literature. J.R. Clark and Ben Powell and several other co-authors on this 2015 paper kind of kicked off this literature, if you will. And what they find is that by looking at immigrant stock and immigrant inflow, so by looking at across countries, the amount or the number of immigrants in a country and then inflow, the number coming into a country, they don't find any evidence that it's decreasing those countries' economic freedom. So we can talk more about the data if anybody is interested in that, but in general, again, you may have read papers or read these papers that describe the data, but the Economic Freedom Index is one of our best measures of measuring broadly what we would consider economic institutions or those basic principles that Adam Smith described as, this is what you need: private property rights, low regulation, let people, kind of figure out how to do business and get along and pursue profits and incur losses. If that's what, happens, that type of environment's what's going to underpin economic growth. And so we currently have a really great way of measuring that, in which we call the Economic Freedom Index. And so by looking at that, we don't see any evidence that the share of immigrant population in a country or the inflow of immigrants into a country decreases the quality of economic institutions. And so that's kind of the first pushback against Borjas's claim that they're going to low skilled labor moves into a rich country that has high quality institutions. That's why they're rich. And it's going to deteriorate, at least in this case, their economic institutions. The next two papers follow that up with more of what we would consider a case study, but it's both of these papers are unique and similar to the way that the IRCA reform is going to be very critical to my results in my paper I will present and go through here in a second. And that what they do is they use this experience with Israel and then with the Nebraska 2020 paper, Jordan, as a natural experiment. So again, we get around some of the econometric issues that can happen with cross-country data. I mean, everything's endogenous at some point, especially with cross-country work. But so with the Powell 2017 paper, they're looking at what happened in Israel as a result of mass migration during the 1990s. So we get the fall of the Soviet Union, and Israel had a unique law in that anyone in the world that wanted to return to Israel that had Jewish ancestry could come. So you immediately became a citizen. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, we see a massive migration to Israel from the Jewish population that had been located in the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc. So it's a unique subset of individuals, but it was unexpected. And you also then see this high inflow of typically high skilled labor. So it's not a perfect test of Warhas's concern, but it was very, very much a unique setting to test, okay, you get massive unexpected migration into a country. Well, then what happened to their economic institutions over time? And so they're able to use an empirical technique, which I'll explain a little bit more in detail in a second, that can kind of tease out the noise that we can't do in other types of models. And what they find is that there is actually institutional improvement. So in the Clark et al. Paper, they find no evidence of decline, but the Israel paper, we see signs of institutional improvement in Israel in the years following this massive increase in Israel's population. And that they argue strongly that that would not have occurred without the immigration into Israel. Similarly, the Narasta 2020 paper uses Jordan's mass immigration in 1990 as a natural experiment. And so when Saddam Hussein entered Kuwait, Jordan experienced a lot of refugees. And I don't remember the exact legal change, but there may have been also kind of a unique legal situation in which they also basically became citizens. So when we start getting into, well, what are the mechanics behind how immigrants would impact? Like, what is the mechanism through which immigrants would impact the destinations, countries, institutions? We typically think, well, maybe the way that they would vote. So that's why it's important in both of these cases that they were granted legal status. So they could potentially vote or have influence over politics or influence over policies. So the refugee surge was the main mechanism by which Jordan experienced increases in their economic institutions. Both of these papers use the Economic Freedom Index for measures of economic institutions with similar kind of conclusions, but stronger than that initial Clark paper, where they say both of these countries, after a massive, unexpected increase in their population from people that, coming from other countries, experience institutional improvement. Turning to the US level data, your professor has authored quite a few of these papers and kind of followed the international cross-country literature. And then we said, okay, well, the US actually has access to some better data than we do across countries, for example. And the US maybe, is a unique country in and of itself because we are a country of immigrants. So let's try to understand how it affects the economic institutions across states. And so two of your professors actually have two great papers that do this. And in their 2018 paper, they find no relation between immigration and institutions, meaning that, again, similar to the original Clark et al. Paper, they don't find a decline in US state institutions. There's a sister index that we use at the US state level to measure economic institutions. It's called the Economic Freedom of North America Index. It's very similar in terms of trying to understand how much government regulation, basically how much government spending is in your state, the level of taxation, how free are your labor markets, and then also looking at taxes. And so again, taxes and government spending and the labor market regulation, and trying to understand that as a broad measure for economic freedom or the quality of economic institutions. And again, no decline in economic institutions from the stock or flow of immigrants into US states. And then in a follow-up paper, they do know a negative short-run effect that'll dissipate in the long run. In another paper somewhat similar, but they also find, Tuzinski and Stansel find no significant relation between immigration and US institutions, regardless of the economic conditions from an immigrant's home country. And so I was talking with Alex before class, and he's currently working on a paper that's building off of the idea of, okay, well, we need to get better at understanding, like Warhas makes this broad stroke claim, but what are the immigrants bringing with them? And so that's what he's trying to do, is to look at their home country's quality of institutions relative to the US and relative to US states, and say, can we get better analysis at understanding this? And this initial kind of first blush of with the Tuzinski and Stansel paper, they don't find that the economic conditions of an immigrant's home country then is important in determining how it would affect their destination state's economic institutions. So again, in general, we're not finding any evidence of, at least it's not harmful. We have the two Jordan and the Israel studies that find that it's positive, but we at least in general can say that we do not find any evidence that through immigration do we see harm caused to economic institutions. So that's where me and my two grad students at Mississippi State, so we started working on this paper quite a while ago. And maybe as you guys have started doing your own research, you realize how time consuming it actually is. So it's hard to come up with an idea, let alone then actually start formalizing that and doing a lit review. And then if you gather data, so it takes a while. So this was a project that we started in 2017, and it's just now published. So the idea here is that, could we use this federal legal change in the US, the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, is kind of a shock to our immigrant population. So it's a little bit different in the past papers that we've been talking about and Warhas's concern, in that it's not directly related to flow, immigrant flow, but it's related to immigrants who were already living in the US, basically undocumented or illegally living in the US. And then we turn them into legal citizens. And so at the stroke of this legislation, that's what happened. And we can get into some of the politics of, like, how did that actually happen? And you guys, especially given today's climate with understanding certain issues. But what the idea behind it was, they wanted to reduce the stock of undocumented immigrants by granting them amnesty. So anyone, basically, you had to apply for it, and there were certain conditions. But if you were in the US before January 1st of 1982, for the most part, you could apply for amnesty under the IRCA 1986 Act. Also within this federal legislation is that it increased funds available for infrastructure at the border. So the idea is somewhat twofold. And all right, if you're here, we're going to let you become a legal citizen or legally be here, but we don't want more of you coming in illegally. So they could create an incentive problem, depending on what your views are. But from a politician standpoint, they're like, okay, we're going to grant amnesty, but also increase border security so that more people we're not creating a situation in which more people then try to come here undocumented. It also changed requirements for employers to verify the legal status of workers and established penalties for noncompliance. So this was a big change in the legislation. I am not familiar with how effective that was. Like, I don't know if that legal change actually ended up, really causing employers to document and verify more so than what had been done in the past, but that was a big selling point of the legislation. It did make public benefits available. So that is important, because part of the concern, and more of what we'll get into on Thursday, is this concern that immigrants come here and just consume public benefits and don't pay for it. And so under IRCA, if you were granted amnesty, you would be available for public benefit programs at both the state and federal level 5 years after legalization. So there is a time gap. And also introduced requirements to verify the immigration status. So you had to show that you were legalized under this act. So what this did is that it legalized roughly 3 million immigrants, primarily from low productivity countries in the US, so in a high productivity country with a different cultural heritage. So part of the issue of relating the Israel and Jordan study is that the immigrants coming into those countries were typically higher skilled and from the same culture. So people from Jewish heritage was going back to Israel. They argue that they're not exactly the same, but that is a debate. And they say, okay, what we're really worried about is whenever you allow individuals to come in that are low productivity and have a different culture. And so this is a better test of that, even though those workers were already here, but now we're legalizing them. So we're granting them different rights than what they would have had before. 90% of those legalized by IRCA were from Latin American countries, which have lower productivity and lower quality institutions than the US does. So again, that's a better test for Borjas's concern that if you allow migration from low productivity countries from immigrants who have lower quality skill sets, then you're going to see the deterioration of our institutions. So one of the important things that, again, Borjas doesn't directly spell out is how. How are they going to cause decline? And so we have to have some sort of theoretical mechanisms to say, well, these are potential ways that they could. So we don't know, partly because there's not as much conversation around it, and then partly because there's not really data to directly test these issues, specifically related to voting. But it is theoretically a mechanism through which, once you are legalized and you have the right to vote, you can change where you're living, whether it would be through local politics at the state level or at the federal level. So for us, the voting effect would not have occurred until 1996. So they're not eligible for naturalization, even though they would be legalized much sooner, but they couldn't vote until after 1996. So it's about a decade in between the initial passing of the act into when we think that the mechanism through which decreasing the quality of institutions would take place during voting. So the direct mechanism doesn't seem to be as relevant in the short run for this particular case study. And only 20% applied for naturalization, which I think is a somewhat interesting statistic. Not really sure why, but that's the data that we could find. And so the voting effect would occur in the long run, if at all. Again, we don't have great data on immigrant voting or immigrants that come into the country who have now been naturalized and vote in elections, how they vote and where they came from. And so you're kind of hypothesizing and then reading between the lines when you're trying to look at a voting effect. But for us, any effect that we would see would not, we argue, be related to voting at least for a decade after 1986. So therefore, we focus more on these indirect effects. So one of the major concerns in the labor econ literature is from labor competition. So if you allow people to come in, the US citizens have to compete with those people that you just let in, whether it would be high skilled or low skilled. Typically, the arguments tend to be more at the low skilled level. And most of the research looks at how, if you allow immigrants with lower skill coming in, how do they affect low skilled labor market outcomes for US citizens? And so that's one area in which we hypothesize that, it could affect different labor market competitions, which then could cause a native voting response. So for example, if you are working at minimum wage or around kind of that level, and you see an increase in your competition from the inflow of lower skilled labor, then you may in the next election cycle or vote for someone who's in favor of increasing the minimum wage because you think that you could still outcompete them at a higher wage level, which would, in the way we measure it, cause a decline in our economic freedom, our economic institutions. One of the other ways is through consumption of public goods and benefits. So one of the other ways that we measure economic institutions is government reach. So how involved is government in the economy? And so if you see an increase in government expenditures due to an increase in public consumption of public benefits, then that could also cause a decline in the institutional quality. Interestingly, IRCA required training in English. And this happened through local community colleges. So the federal government provided states with funding, and it was required if you applied for amnesty under IRCA that you would have English language training, which I find interesting. And I wonder like how that was implemented and how those things actually worked. And again, just broadly speaking, we could think of just the presence of others, presence of other people living in your city now that come from a different culture. You could, as a native, respond differently in your own behavior, particularly at the voting booth, or in other informal ways that could, again, then just influence our economic institutions. So most states did not experience or did not have individuals living in those states that would have been able to apply for legalization under IRCA. So we really focus on 6 states. So California, by and far, had the most immigrants living in a state that was eligible to apply for legalization under IRCA. And so the percent of total legalized, so I think the 3 million roughly that was legalized in the country under IRCA, over half were in California. So we're going to end up focusing on California quite a bit, but we'll look at these 6 states initially. And so that's about 5% of California's total population in 1990. So that's big. That's a big effect in the sense of could it matter? Are we talking about, if it wouldn't have been a large enough population that was legalized, we think, well, then it's not going to end up being able to have an effect. But almost 5% of the whole state's population, which was already a big state in 1990, like, okay, that's significant. We should be able to pick something up there if there is something to see. Texas was in the 2nd largest state. Of the percent, again, legalized under IRCA, they had 15%. So again, major drop off. So most of them, again, are in California. New York, Illinois, Florida, and Arizona had, again, those are the top 6. And then there's very, very few that are in other states. And so when we kind of look at this, we see that, I guess we argue, because again, it's not perfect, that we can focus on these 6 states relative to the other states and create a test between those. We're going to have what we call the IRCA states and then the rest of US states and kind of compare and contrast. Well, since they legalized immigrants and the other states didn't, what happened? So that's kind of the general way we're going to approach this. So our identification strategy is to use this as a natural experiment to examine how immigration affects our economic institutions. Again, just as a reminder, low-skilled immigrants coming from low-quality institution countries are now being legalized in a country with high-quality institutions. I mentioned this a second ago, but our way of measuring it is from the Economic Freedom of North America. It's on a scale from 0 to 10. And what's included in the index is government spending, taxes, and labor market freedom. So we have an overall index and then these 3 kind of sub-indices. So in order to create what we call a counterfactual, so as if the IRCA never passed, we use what's called a synthetic control method. So we're basically going to create like a fake California or a fake IRCA state that didn't experience the legalization of immigrants and then compare and contrast. And the way that you do this is by looking at those other states in the US that did not legalize very many immigrants under IRCA. So it's an empirical technique creating what we call a counterfactual by weighting a combination of the other states. So a synthetic control method creates a counterfactual by weighting pre-IRCA economic freedom scores and other predictive variables. So the other predictive variables we'll talk about in a second, but that just kind of helps you want to basically match what California is or what it looks like on certain variables that are very similar to other states, for example, but not the immigrant experience. So that is ineffectively what we're doing by creating this synthetic IRCA state. It's one, we're going to track economic freedom after 1986. So that was the legal change, the year of the legal change, as if IRCA never happened. So that's what we mean by creating a counterfactual. So we don't know, when we're trying to tease out empirical analysis, you have an event that happens and we have different techniques of trying to understand the cause and effect of that, but it's very difficult because it has happened. And what you really want to know is what would have been the outcome if that event didn't happen. So that's, again, what we mean by creating this counterfactual, as if, in this case, IRCA never happened. So the difference between the synthetic and the real state, so whenever we look at California, for example, the synthetic and real California is going to be attributed to that specific legal change. And for us, we're talking about IRCA. So the synthetic will closely approximate a situation in which IRCA never occurred, because the states included in the synthetic control group experienced very small changes in their population due to IRCA. So that's how we can do this. So that creates a panel data set for 50 states from 1981 to 1997. You have 6 what we call pre-treatment years, basically before IRCA. And our time period is somewhat constrained by data availability. So we can't go back prior to 1981 due to the Economic Freedom Index data availability. And you don't necessarily want to go too far out, because then you can't necessarily attribute that to IRCA, but we'll have some other tests where we will extend the time period. So you have 6 pre-treatment years, 11 post-treatment years. We create the synthetic or the counterfactual. So you synthesize and create your IRCA state with what we call 5 predictor variables. So you're going to use income per capita in a state, the share of native born with a high school diploma, share of naturalization. So basically, how large was your immigrant population before 1986? And then your economic freedom scores beforehand. This, the RMSPE value, you want it to be really low, meaning that they match. So before the intervention, what does your synthetic and real California, for example, look like? So you want that to be, you want them to basically be identical. And that's what that score will tell you, that since it's really close to 0, they look very similar. So you're creating a good fake state or good fake IRCA state. So these are our states that ended up, so we don't pre-select these as the researcher. You do use a statistical software that actually then selects the states to create these weights for your fake synthetic. And so the states that end up entering into our sample include Alaska, Hawaii, Louisiana, Michigan, New Jersey, West Virginia, and Wyoming, partly because they have very low % legalized under IRCA. So that's the first column. We can come back to this if anyone's interested in going through it. Overall, there's no evidence of a long-term effect of the legalization of immigrants on institutional quality. So we don't find any long-run effect. We do find a short-run drop in institutional quality in California, which was the state with the largest % legalized, mainly driven by increase in government expenditures. And we'll come back and we dig into that a little bit more. I know we're getting a little bit short on time. In the long run, California's institutional quality converges with the control group. So real California basically converges with the synthetic California. So you see a short run effect, but in the long run, it goes away. So there's a bunch of graphs, so pictures are always nice. And so this is economic freedom scores in those 6 IRCA states. We combined them into one state. The solid line is basically that one state over from 1981 to 1996, 7, can't remember, 7. Thank you. And then the dotted line is the synthetic or your fake, the one that what would have happened without IRCA. That's the dotted line. And so you see an increase, so the synthetic is higher, which would suggest that if you didn't have IRCA, then the economic freedom score would have been higher, but it's statistically insignificant. So again, in looking at just the top 6, we combine them into basically if that was one state, what would have happened? No result. We look at California plus Texas. Again, this is statistically insignificant, so no effect. We do this, so that California and Texas, we do that because those were the largest 2. and then we do the bottom 4. So we have 6 total IRCA states, California, Texas, then we do the bottom 4. Very similar. There's basically no effect here at all on the point estimates or on their p-value or statistical significance. But then we do, when we look just at California, we do find a statistical difference between the synthetic, so the state that didn't, or fake state that didn't experience IRCA or didn't legalize immigrants, compared to the real. But the convergence then happens around 1993. As you can see, the dotted line and the solid line come back together. So then we thought, well, why? Why is that the case? Okay, California did have the largest amount, over 50% of those legalized were in California, but what was the mechanism? This is just basically another way of testing that. And this is a even fancier model that shows, the flat line means no significance there. So one way of getting at trying to understand, can we attribute this to the 1986 change, is to change your shock date. So we do that by acting as if the event happened in 1983. So we move it back and the graph basically looks identical. So we're at least confident that this increase in the synthetic, or the difference in economic freedom, if IRCA wouldn't have happened, is related to the 1986 IRCA event. So then that's where we dig into those 3 areas. So remember, we have the overall index and then the 3 sub-indices. So within that, you have government spending, taxes, and labor market freedom. And it turns out it was government spending that went up. So remember, under IRCA, they required English language training. They required, or you were eligible for public benefits at the state level. And that would then put a burden on state and local financing if all of a sudden you kind of have overnight a massive increase in the number of people available for public benefits. So then in some sense, we argue it makes sense that government spending went up. This shouldn't be shocking given the way the law was written. But it is statistically different, meaning it is a real effect. And then even though they don't completely converge, this statistical significance does also diminish on government spending. But the other thing that we did was to try to understand where the government spending increased. And so this was California state and local government spending from 1986 to 1995. You do see a huge jump in healthcare spending, so the second to last column. In 1992, almost 38%. So that's a huge jump. And we did look into, the immigrants that were legalized under IRCA would have been eligible for Medicare, Medicaid. So that again could make sense. We see some increases in education around this time period. So around 1989, 1990, you see some increases in education. Maybe that was partly due to the funding to community colleges for English language training programs. If you look at, I think the last one is crime, even though you can't see the header there, and spending on crime. And there is some work within immigration. And I think some of you are working in this space, looking at immigration and crime. There's some evidence there. And so maybe there was some increases in crime. Through legalization, you could argue the opposite. You would have decreased the incentives for crime. But we do see in that same year as healthcare, a massive increase in spending on some criminal justice. No statistical difference in taxes, no statistical difference in the labor market, which is actually quite interesting because we actually thought this is where we would see an effect, if any. Kind of the last one we can talk about is extending that time period. And the reason why we did this is to try to test that voting effect. So IRCA happens in 1986, but they're not able or eligible to vote until about 1996. And so what we would expect is that if there is the voting effect, that potentially in the long run, we're going to see statistical differences. And we did in a couple years, but by I think 2009, the synthetic and real California is statistically indistinguishable. So there's no that's why we argue in the paper, there's no long run effect. So the implications from this is legalization of low skilled, culturally diverse immigrants has no long run effect on state level economic institutions, at least from the way that we've been able to tease this out. You may see a temporary increase in government spending in a state, but we argue it's the way the law was written. And so if you want to naturalize or legalize immigrants in a state and then grant them, certain benefits to go along with that, then you also are going to have to fund it. So that's not, again, super shocking that that's actually what we found. But we did find eventually that converges. The spending went back down to what we would have called the pre-IRCA levels, or what the trend would have been without those immigrants being in that state. So we do think that this kind of alleviates concerns for granting amnesty, and this does have direct implications for some of the current debate around DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Overall, we do think that the work does fall kind of in line with the current literature that supports arguments that relaxed immigration barriers would lead to greater global economic efficiency. All right, so that will end today's talk. I went a little bit longer than I thought I was going to, but I am happy to dig into specifics of the paper. If you want me to go back to especially any of the graphs, I was going a little bit quickly there at the end, and we can stop recording. I can do that, and then we can